Louisiana, 1845. She slammed the Manumission document onto the fire before the ink had even dried on Tibo's copy. 9 men stood watching. Not one of them moved to stop her. Janei DeLaqua turned to the room and said, quietly, like a woman reciting a prayer she had long memorized, "No paper will ever be worth more than what I decide it is worth." That was the moment Antoan Tibo understood he was not dealing with a grieving widow. He was dealing with something far more dangerous. If you are just joining this channel, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter arrived at the Shreveport Factor House on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1845, carried by a courier whose horse had been ridden so hard through the bayou roads that the animal was still trembling when it was handed off to the stable boy. The letter bore the DeLaqua seal, a pressed wax impression of 2 intertwined sugarcane stalks, and it was addressed to Mr. Gerald Fontaine, senior partner of the firm Fontaine, Marsh & Associates. The contents were brief. Pierre DeLaqua was dead. The estate of Belle Reve owed the firm $11,000 in outstanding credit, accumulated over 3 seasons of poor harvests and 1 catastrophic fire that had destroyed the eastern mill. The widow, Janei DeLaqua, was requesting a renegotiation of terms. Gerald Fontaine read the letter twice, then handed it across his desk without a word to the only man in the room he trusted to handle something this delicate without making it worse. Antoan Tibo was 29 years old. He had been with the firm for 4 years, long enough to know which plantation owners drank too much at negotiation tables and which ones wept, and long enough to understand that both were vulnerabilities he could use. He was not a tall man, and he was not an imposing one, but he had a particular kind of patience that made people uncomfortable in ways they could not quite name. He would simply wait. He would sit across from a man who owed money, and he would wait, and eventually the silence would become unbearable, and the man would start talking. And once a man started talking, Tibo had him. "She wants to renegotiate," Fontaine said. "She wants time," Tibo replied. "Same thing." "No," Tibo said slowly, folding the letter with 2 careful creases. "Wanting time means she believes she can pay. Wanting to renegotiate means she believes the debt can be made to look smaller than it is. Those are very different problems." Fontaine studied him for a moment. "Take the riverboat to Opelousas. From there it's 2 hours by road." He paused. "I'm told the estate is in a bad way. Don't let her charm you into extending anything. Come back with a payment schedule, or come back with the documentation for receivership." Tibo tucked the letter into his coat pocket. "Has anyone from the firm been to Belle Reve before?" "Twice. Both times Pierre DeLaqua met us at the dock in Opelousas, and we conducted business at the tavern there. He never invited anyone to the plantation itself." That detail stayed with Tibo as he rode south. A man who conducts business at a tavern rather than at his own home is a man who does not want you to see his home. A man who owes $11,000 and still keeps visitors away from his property is a man with something to protect, or something to hide. He arrived at Belle Reve on the morning of October the 3rd. He had expected neglect. He had expected the particular kind of visible decay that follows when a plantation falls behind on its obligations. The untended fields, the sagging outbuildings, the peeling paint, and the hollow-eyed silence of workers who had not been properly fed. He had seen it before. There was a rhythm to a failing estate, and he knew it well. What he found instead stopped him at the gate. The grounds were immaculate, not just maintained. Immaculate. The fence posts had been freshly whitewashed. The drive up to the main house was raked smooth. The oak trees that lined either side stood with their lower branches trimmed to exactly the same height, as though someone had gone down the row with a ruler. There was not a fallen leaf anywhere on the path. Tibo sat on his horse for a long moment and looked at all of this. Then he looked at the men. There were 9 of them, visible from the gate. One was near the fence at the far left, replacing a board that had not needed replacing, the wood still pale and new. 2 more were at the side of the house, moving a piece of furniture through a doorway with a slowness and deliberateness that struck him as strange. Another stood near the well, doing nothing that Tibo could identify, simply standing with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the road. The remaining 5 were spread across the grounds in positions that, Tibo realized after a moment, covered every visible approach to the main house. They were not working. They were watching. He rode in. The man who met him at the steps was tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray at his temples and an expression that communicated absolutely nothing. He introduced himself as Solomon and said that Mrs. DeLaqua was expecting him and that he would be shown inside. "I'll tie my own horse," Tibo said. "I'll do it," Solomon said. There was nothing threatening in the way he said it. There was nothing deferential either. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered in a tone that suggested the matter was already decided. Tibo handed over the reins and followed a second man up the stairs and through the front door. The interior of the house was cool and dim and smelled faintly of beeswax and something else he couldn't place, something herbal and slightly sharp. The floors were polished. The furniture was arranged with a kind of precision that felt less like decoration and more like deliberate placement. He noticed on the mantelpiece above the fireplace a row of small wooden figurines, 9 of them, each one different, carved with enough detail that they seemed to have faces, though he was moving too quickly past them to be certain. He was shown into a sitting room and left alone. He waited 7 minutes. He counted them. When Janei DeLaqua entered the room, she was not what he had prepared himself for. He had built a picture in his mind during the 2 days of travel, a woman undone by grief and financial pressure, a woman who would either weep or bargain or both. A woman he could handle. She was perhaps 40, though she carried herself in a way that made age feel irrelevant. She wore deep blue, not black, and her hair was pinned with an efficiency that had nothing ceremonial about it. She did not extend her hand. She sat down across from him, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at him with gray eyes that were doing something he had rarely seen in a first meeting. She was reading him, not making conversation, not performing composure. She was simply, quietly, reading him. "Mr. Tibo," she said, "I assume you've reviewed the outstanding balance?" "I have." "And Mr. Fontaine's position is receivership, unless I produce terms." "Those are his instructions to me, yes." She nodded once, as though this confirmed something she had already known. "Pierre was a good man," she said, "but he was not a careful one. He borrowed against expectations rather than against reality. That is a habit I do not share." She paused. "Belle Rev will meet its obligations, not on Mr. Fontaine's timeline, on mine." Tibo kept his voice even. "With respect, Mrs. DeLaqua, the obligation is already past due by 14 months. The firm's patience is something you are here to perform," she said. And there was no sharpness in it, no rudeness, just a calm accuracy that made the sentence feel like a wall being placed in front of him. "I understand your position completely. You are here to intimidate me into an agreement that benefits Fontaine, Marsh, and Associates. And you have done this before with widows, and you have been successful before with widows. I am telling you, as clearly and as early as possible, that I am not a widow in the way that you mean." The room held that silence. Outside, somewhere near the east side of the house, Tibo could hear footsteps. Slow, steady footsteps, moving in a pattern he could not name, back and forth along the exterior wall. He thought of the men he had seen at the gate. He thought of Solomon taking his horse with a certainty that left no room for argument. "What are you then?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood, and she crossed to the mantelpiece, and she picked up one of the carved wooden figurines and turned it over in her hands. "I am the woman who kept this estate alive through 4 years of Pierre's decisions," she said. "I am the woman who knows every debt, every contract, every agreement made in this parish under the DeLaqua name. And I am the woman those 9 men outside would walk through fire for." She set the figurine down carefully in exactly the spot where it had been. "Now, would you like to discuss terms, or would you like to continue performing patience at me?" Tibo reached for his ledger. He had been in 100 negotiations. He had sat across from desperate men and composed men and furious men. He had sat across from women who cried and women who threatened and women who tried to seduce the debt away. He had never sat across from anyone who made him feel, from the very first exchange, that he was the one who had walked into a trap. He opened the ledger. He kept his face still, and in the back of his mind, very quietly, a thought he could not shake took root and held. He was not here to collect a debt. He had been let in. Tibo left the sitting room that evening with a payment schedule in his coat pocket and a feeling in his chest he could not name. The numbers Janei had proposed were reasonable, more than reasonable in fact. They were precise. She had cited crop yields, current sugar prices, projected harvest timelines, and the exact weight of the outstanding debt against the estate's remaining assets, with a fluency that no grieving widow should have possessed 6 months after her husband's death. Fontaine would accept the terms. Tibo knew that before he had even folded the paper. What he did not know, what he could not stop turning over in his mind as Solomon showed him to the guest room at the far end of the upper hall, was why she had let him in at all. A woman with that kind of command did not need to negotiate. She could have sent a letter. She could have had her attorney respond to the firm's demands. Instead, she had invited the representative of her creditor into her home, sat him down, and handed him exactly what he needed. That was not the behavior of a woman defending herself. That was the behavior of a woman who wanted someone inside the house. He did not sleep well. At 2:30 in the morning, he heard footsteps in the hall outside his door. Not hurried, not stealthy. Slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the corridor to the other and back again. He lay still and counted the passes. 7. Then silence. He got up and opened the door. The hall was empty, but at the far end, near the top of the staircase, one of the small oil lamps was still burning. In its light, he could see a mark on the floor that he had not noticed during the day. A dark stain, roughly circular, perhaps 2 feet across, in the wood just at the threshold of the room opposite his. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he went back inside and sat on the edge of the bed with his hands on his knees until morning. He came down to breakfast and found 4 of the 9 men already in the dining room, not eating, standing. One at each corner of the room, arms at their sides, eyes forward. Janei sat at the head of the table with a cup of coffee and a newspaper folded to a specific column, which she did not put down when he entered. "You didn't sleep," she said without looking up. "I slept fine." "You didn't." She turned a page. "Men who sleep well don't come to breakfast with that particular expression." "Sit down." He sat. One of the men moved to the sideboard and poured coffee without being asked. Tibo watched him do it. The man's movements were so controlled, so practiced, that it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately articulate. It wasn't servility. He had seen servility. This was something else. This was the movement of a man who had decided, at some point, to become invisible, and had practiced it so thoroughly that he had nearly succeeded. "I'd like to understand the arrangement here," Tibo said. Janei lowered the newspaper. "The arrangement?" "The men, what they do, how the estate operates." She looked at him with those gray eyes for a moment, and then she said something that he would remember for the rest of his life. "They stay because they choose to stay." The room went absolutely still. One of the men in the corner shifted his weight slightly. Just slightly. Tibo caught it. "That is not a legal arrangement in Louisiana," he said carefully. "No," Janei agreed. "It is not." She picked up her coffee cup. "And yet here we all are." He should have left that morning. He knew that. He had the signed payment schedule. He had what Fontaine sent him for. There was no professional reason to remain at Belrev for a second day. But something held him, some combination of professional suspicion and a deeper, more personal need to understand what he was looking at. And so when Janei offered to show him the estate's account books after breakfast, he said yes. The account books were kept in a locked room off the main study. Janei produced a key from a chain around her wrist, unlocked the door, and then stepped aside to let him enter first. It was a small room, barely large enough for the desk and the 2 chairs and the tall cabinet that held the ledgers. The cabinet was locked as well. She unlocked that too, and she placed 3 leather-bound volumes on the desk in front of him. And then she sat in the second chair and watched him work. He was 40 minutes into the first ledger when he found it. It was not an entry that would have meant anything to someone who was not paying close attention. It appeared as a simple land transaction from 1831, a purchase of a small parcel of adjacent swampland for a figure that was unremarkable. But the name of the seller was a name Tibo recognized, because 2 years earlier he had processed a different transaction connected to the same family, the Courtemanche family. New Orleans abolitionists, known in certain legal circles for a specific and controversial practice, the quiet drafting of manumission documents that were intended to survive the deaths of the enslaved person's legal owners. He kept his face completely still. He turned the page. He kept reading. By the time he reached the end of the first volume, he had found 3 more references, all of them coded within routine entries, all of them, when read in sequence, pointing toward the same conclusion. Pierre DeLaqua had made an arrangement with the Courtemanche family before his death, an arrangement involving a document that, if legitimate, would have meant that all 9 men in the house were not enslaved, had not been legally enslaved for some time. He closed the ledger. He looked up at Janei. She was watching him with an expression that had not changed in 40 minutes, patient and perfectly composed. And in that moment, he understood that she had known exactly which page he would stop on. She had given him the books because she wanted him to find it. "You knew I would see it," he said. "I knew you were thorough," she replied. "Where is the document?" "Gone." "Gone how?" "Pierre destroyed it the week before he died. He had a change of heart." She said it simply, without emotion, as though she were reporting a weather condition. "He decided that the arrangement was a liability, that if it became known, the DeLaqua name would be finished in this parish. He burned it in the fireplace in this room." Tibo was quiet for a long moment. "And the men know this?" "The men were present when he did it." The weight of that settled over him like something physical. He thought about what it meant to watch the paper that represented your freedom turned to ash, while the man who held your life in his hands made a business decision. He thought about 9 men standing in a room while everything they had been promised was destroyed in front of them. And then he thought about what those 9 men had been doing every day since. Staying. Choosing, as Janei had said, to stay. "Why?" he asked. He wasn't sure what exactly he was asking why, too. There were too many questions inside the word. Janei stood. She walked to the cabinet and picked up something from the top shelf that he hadn't noticed before. A folded piece of paper, older than the ledgers, the edges brown and soft with age. She placed it on the desk in front of him. He unfolded it with 2 careful fingers. It was a copy,
or something presented as a copy.
The handwriting matched the style of the original court-de-manche documents he had seen in New Orleans. The particular formal flourish of the letters, the specific language of the manumission clause. But there was something about the ink. Something about the way the date sat at the top of the page. He had spent 4 years handling documents in a factor house. He knew what old paper felt like. This was not as old as it was pretending to be. He looked up at her. She did not look away.
"That's not the original," he said.
"No," she said quietly. "It is not. You had it made." "I had it prepared," she said, and the distinction in her voice was slight but deliberate. "There is a difference between fabrication and preservation. The original document existed. Pierre destroyed it out of cowardice. This is a record of what existed, what was promised." She paused. "Those men gave everything they had to this estate for years on the strength of a promise. I kept the promise." Tibo stared at the paper. His hands were not entirely steady. He was looking at a document that could free 9 people. He was also looking at a document that was, by any legal standard in the state of Louisiana in 1845, a fraud. And he was sitting in the home of the woman who had made it, who had just admitted it to him, who had shown it to him voluntarily, who was watching him now with the patience of someone who had already calculated every possible response he might have and had an answer prepared for each one. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked. "Because you were going to find it anyway," she said. "Men like you always find things. I would rather you find it here, in this room, from my hands, than find it somewhere else and misunderstand it. And if I report this to Fontaine, if I report this to the magistrate." She picked up the document, folded it, and held it in both hands, and she looked at him across the desk with something in her eyes that was not fear, not defiance, not a plea. It was a kind of exhausted certainty. "Then 9 men who have already lost their freedom once will lose it again," she said. "And you will have to decide for the rest of your life whether the law you served that day was justice or just paper." Tibo stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there for a long time. Behind him, the room was absolutely silent, and somewhere below in the house he heard footsteps, slow and steady. 9 sets of them moving through the rooms of Belle Reve like a pulse, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Tibo left Belle Reve before dawn. He did not say goodbye to Janei DeLaqua. He did not speak to Solomon or to any of the other men. He simply rose in the gray dark before the house woke, gathered his bag, and walked his horse quietly down the raked drive and onto the bayou road without looking back. The payment schedule was in his coat pocket. The image of that fraudulent document was burned into the back of his eyes, and Janei's final words were still moving through him like a slow poison he could not sweat out. "You will have to decide for the rest of your life whether the law you served that day was justice or just paper." He rode hard for 6 hours. He stopped once at a watering trough outside a crossroads store near Opelousas, and he sat on his horse in the early afternoon heat and stared at nothing for a long time. A man came out of the store and asked him if he was all right. Tibo said yes. The man looked at him the way people look at someone who has clearly said the wrong word and went back inside. By the time he reached Shreveport, he had made his decision, or he believed he had. He went to Fontaine first. He presented the payment schedule. Fontaine reviewed the terms, nodded slowly, and said they were acceptable. He asked how the widow had seemed. Tibo said she had seemed composed. Fontaine said that was good. He said Pierre DeLaqua had always been the unstable element in that marriage, and that it did not surprise him at all that the woman was managing better without him. Then he poured 2 glasses of bourbon and handed one to Tibo and said, "Good work. and that was the end of the professional part of the meeting. Tibo did not tell him about the document. He told himself that was because he needed time to think. That was not entirely true. The fuller truth was that he had sat in that room at Belle Rev and looked at a piece of paper and felt something shift inside him that he could not put back. He had spent 4 years in a factor house measuring the value of human beings against crop yields and debt schedules, and he had managed to keep that reality at a comfortable distance by focusing on the numbers. Numbers were clean. Numbers did not look back at you from across a desk with 14 years of broken promises in their eyes. The 9 men of Belle Rev had looked back at him. He spent 3 days in Shreveport, trying to drink that look away. On the 4th day, he went to see a man named Clarence Hudd. Hudd was not a lawyer in any formal sense. He was something more useful and considerably less reputable. He was a document examiner, a man who had spent 30 years in the courts of Louisiana, determining the authenticity of wills, land grants, contracts, and various other papers whose legitimacy was in dispute. He was 70 years old, half blind in his left eye, and he had an opinion about everything and the social standing to share it with anyone he chose. Tibo sat across from him in the cluttered back room of his house on Kane Street and described the document without producing it. He described the paper, the ink, the handwriting style, the specific language of the manumission clause. He described the date. He described the feeling in his hands when he had held it. Hudd listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Courtemanche style, you said?" "Yes." "Which branch of the family?" "I don't know." Hudd was quiet for a moment. The Courtemanche family had a particular way of drafting manumission documents. Very specific phrasing in the Liberty Clause, a particular order of the witnesses' attestations. If someone was forging one of their documents, they would need access to an original to copy the style that precisely. He leaned forward. Where would a plantation widow in the Atchafalaya Basin get access to an original Courtemanche manumission document? Tibo had not asked himself that question. He asked it now. The answer that came back to him was not comfortable. "Pierre," he said slowly. "Pierre DeLaqua had one. The original. He destroyed it, but before he destroyed it, someone in that house saw it closely enough to reproduce it. Someone with a very particular skill," Hudd said. "One of the men," Tibo said. "One of the 9. Hudd sat back. The room was quiet for a long moment. "You understand what that means? If one of those men produced that document, it wasn't the widow acting alone. It was a collaboration, a deliberate, sustained, coordinated act of forgery between a white woman and 9 enslaved men in the state of Louisiana." He paused. "That is not a scandal. That is a hanging." Tibo walked out of Hudd's house and stood in the street for a long time. He had come to Shreveport believing he was deciding whether to report Janei DeLaqua. He understood now that he had been thinking about the wrong person the entire time. The question was never about Janei. The question was about the men, or the men who had looked at their last chance at freedom burning in a fireplace and had decided, quietly and carefully, and without anyone's permission, to make another one. He went back to Fontaine that evening and asked for 2 more weeks of travel expenses. He said there were irregularities in the estate accounts that required further examination. Fontaine, still satisfied with the payment schedule, approved the request without much curiosity. Tibo was on a southbound road before breakfast the next morning. He arrived at Belle Rev in the late afternoon of the following day. Solomon met him at the gate. The expression on the man's face did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted in a way that Tibo caught and could not interpret. "She's expecting you," Solomon said. "I didn't send word." "She's been expecting you since the morning you left." Janei received him in the study this time, not the sitting room. The account books were already on the desk, as though they had never been put away. She sat behind the desk rather than beside it,
and that change in position was not subtle.
She was not playing the role of widow or negotiating partner today. She was sitting in the chair of someone who owned the room.
"You went to HUD," she said before he could speak. The air went out of him. "How do you know that name?" "Because Pierre used him too, twice. Both times to examine documents that Pierre believed might expose him to legal difficulty." She folded her hands on the desk. "What did HUD tell you?" Tibo sat down without being invited to.
He told me that whoever produced that document had access to an original. He told me that meant it wasn't you acting alone. Janei said nothing. "Which one of them made it?" Tibo asked. The silence lasted long enough that he began to think she was not going to answer. Then the door behind him opened. He turned. Solomon walked into the room and closed the door behind him and stood with his back against it, and for the first time since Tibo had arrived at Belle Reve, he spoke in more than single sentences. "My father was a free man in Saint-Domingue," Solomon said. "He came to Louisiana before the territory changed hands. He brought his papers with him, all of them. He was a notary's apprentice for 11 years, and he could reproduce any document he had seen with his hands alone." He paused. "Pierre DeLaqua bought him in 1819, bought him knowing what he was, knowing what he could do, and used him for 15 years to forge land surveys and timber contracts and bills of sale whenever it suited the DeLaqua interests." Another pause. "When Pierre burned the Courtemanche document, I watched his face while he did it. He was not conflicted. He was relieved. He had never intended to honor it. It was leverage he had used to keep us cooperative, and he was tired of maintaining it." The room held that. Tibo sat very still. "You watched Pierre DeLaqua burn your freedom," he said, "and then you reproduced it from memory." "My father's memory lived in my hands," Solomon said simply. "I wrote it the night after Pierre burned it. I wrote it exactly as I had read it, every word." Tibo looked from Solomon to Janei and back again. "And she knew." "I brought it to her the morning after Pierre died," Solomon said. "Not before. She had nothing to do with its creation." "But she kept it," Tibo said, looking at Janei now. "She kept it, and she used it, and she showed it to me." "I kept it because it represented a truth," Janei said. "Pierre made a promise. Solomon's father helped Pierre build this estate from a failing property into something worth $11,000 to your firm. That promise had value, regardless of whether the paper was original or not." Tibo stood up. His voice came out harder than he intended. "That is not how the law works." "I know exactly how the law works," Janei said, and the calm in her voice cracked for the first time, just slightly, just enough to show something raw underneath it. "I have watched this law work my entire life. I watched it work when Pierre's father sold Solomon's mother away from her children because he needed to settle a gambling debt. I watched it work when the parish court returned 2 men who had escaped to Natchez and flogged them in the public square as a lesson. I know precisely how the law works, Mr. Tibo. I am asking you to consider whether you want to be the instrument of it today." The silence that followed was the longest of the entire 3 days Tibo had spent at Belle Reve. Longer than the silence in the sitting room on the first day. Longer than the silence when she had handed him the document. This silence had weight to it, real weight, the kind that settles into a man's bones and stays there. He looked at Solomon. Solomon was watching him with an expression that was not hope. It was something more frightening than hope. It was the expression of a man who had already survived the worst possible outcome once, and was simply waiting to find out if he would have to survive it again. Tibo picked up his hat from the desk. "I'm going to Baton Rouge," he said. Janei did not move. "I am going to present the document to the circuit tribunal," he said. "And I am going to request a legal determination of its validity." Solomon's jaw tightened, just slightly. "That is your right," Janei said quietly. "Yes," Tibo said. It is. He held her gaze for one more moment. And when the tribunal examines it, everything in those account books will come with it. Everything Pierre DeLaqua used Solomon's skills for across 20 years. Every forged survey, every fraudulent bill of sale, every document in this parish that bears the DeLaqua name and Pierre's private mark. He put on his hat. I am not going to Baton Rouge to destroy those men. I am going to make it impossible for anyone to destroy them quietly. He walked to the door. Solomon stepped aside without a word. In the hall, Tibo stopped once, his hand on the doorframe, his back still to the room. He did not turn around. He said to no one in particular and to everyone at once, whatever happens in Baton Rouge, those account books should not be in this house when I arrive back. Then he walked out into the Louisiana afternoon, and the door closed behind him, and Belle Reve held its breath. The road to Baton Rouge took Tibo 2 days. He rode them in near silence, stopping only when his horse demanded it, eating without tasting anything, sleeping in short, restless intervals at a roadside inn where the walls were thin and the other guests were loud, and none of it mattered because he was not sleeping anyway. He was rehearsing. He was turning the words over and over in his mind, arranging them, testing them against imagined questions from imagined judges, dismantling them, rebuilding them. He was preparing for a legal proceeding that he had no official standing to initiate, armed with a document he knew was fraudulent, intending to use it not to prove what it claimed, but to force open a much larger truth that the state of Louisiana had every institutional reason to keep buried. He knew, rationally, that it was likely to fail. He knew that walking into a circuit tribunal in Baton Rouge in October of 1845 and presenting a manumission document on behalf of 9 enslaved men was not a legal strategy. It was a gesture. And gestures in the courts of the antebellum South were not just ineffective, they were dangerous. They drew attention. They made enemies. They put names on lists that the wrong people kept. He presented the document anyway. The clerk at the tribunal office took it from him without expression and told him to return in 3 days for a preliminary hearing. Tibo spent those 3 days in a boarding house 2 streets from the courthouse. And on the second evening, a man he had never seen before knocked on his door and told him, without introducing himself, that it would be in his interest to withdraw the petition before the hearing. Tibo asked who had sent him. The man said that the name did not matter and that the message was the same regardless. Tibo closed the door in his face. That was the moment he understood that Janei had been right about one thing entirely. The document was never really the issue. The document was a key. What it unlocked was not a legal question about 9 men's freedom. What it unlocked was the full accounting of everything Pierre DeLaqua had built on fraudulent ground. And there were men in Baton Rouge, men with land grants and timber contracts and business arrangements stretching back 20 years, who could not afford to have that accounting opened. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Tibo sat at a narrow table across from 2 tribunal judges and a parish attorney named Broussard, who had the manner of a man who had already written the outcome before entering the room. The document was examined. A handwriting expert was produced who had apparently been available on very short notice and who stated, with great professional confidence, that the document bore signs of recent fabrication. Tibo presented his counter-argument. He cited the Courtemanche family records. He cited the specific legal language of the Liberty Clause. He cited 3 other manumission documents from the same period that used identical phrasing and had been accepted as legitimate by the very court he was standing in. Broussard objected to each citation on procedural grounds. Both judges sustained every objection. Then Broussard did something that Tibo had not anticipated. He produced his own documents, not related to the manumission, related to the account books. Tibo felt the floor shift under him. The account books were supposed to be gone. He had told Janei, standing in the doorway of the study, that those books should not be in the house when he returned. He had said it clearly. He had meant it as protection, as a way of removing the evidence of Pierre's forgeries before anyone could use it to threaten the men. But Broussard was holding a page from one of those ledgers, a page Tibo recognized, and he was reading from it in a flat, carrying voice, and what he was describing was not Pierre DeLaqua's fraudulent contracts. He was describing Tibo's own visit to Belle Reve. The dates, the meetings, the guest room, the morning he had spent with the account books. Broussard framed it with the quiet precision of a man who had rehearsed his phrasing very carefully. He suggested that Tibo had not discovered a fraud. He suggested that Tibo had been recruited into one. That a woman facing financial ruin had identified a junior associate with moral ambitions above his station and had used those ambitions as a tool. One of the judges leaned forward and asked Tibo directly whether he had known the document was fraudulent when he presented it. The room was absolutely silent. Tibo looked at the judge. He thought about the answer that would save his career.
He thought about the answer that was true. He thought about Solomon standing with his back against the study door, describing his father's 11 years as a notary's apprentice in Saint-Domingue, and the way his voice had carried no plea in it, only a bare and devastating factual account of everything that had been taken, and everything that had been built back up from nothing, in secret, with bare hands, in the dark.
"I believed the document represented a legitimate promise," Tibo said.
"Whether the paper itself was original is a different question from whether the obligation it described was real." Broussard smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. The tribunal recessed for 40 minutes. When the judges returned, the lead judge read the determination in a voice that was bored and final and utterly certain of itself. The document was ruled fraudulent. The petition was dismissed. The matter of the 9 men's status was declared resolved in favor of the existing legal arrangement, and Antoan Tibo was formally censured for presenting a document of questionable authenticity to a court of law, a notation that would follow his name in every professional record in the state of Louisiana. He walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon heat and stood on the steps and breathed. He had lost. He had known he would likely lose. The knowing did not make the weight of it any lighter. What he had not anticipated was what was waiting for him when he returned to Shreveport. Fontaine had received a letter, not from the tribunal, from Janei DeLaqua. It had arrived, by some arrangement Tibo could not explain, on the same morning the hearing had taken place, as though she had written it before she knew the outcome, or as though she had known the outcome all along. The letter did not address the tribunal or the document or anything that had happened in Baton Rouge. It was a letter about the debt. Specifically, it was a letter containing a banker's note for the full $11,000, not a payment schedule, not a partial settlement. The complete outstanding balance, paid in full, with a brief and impeccably composed cover note that said only that the DeLaqua estate wished to conclude its relationship with the firm of Fontaine, Marsh and Associates on clear terms, and that it thanked them for their patience. Fontaine was delighted. He told Tibo the matter was closed. He told him the censure was unfortunate, but survivable. He poured bourbon and said, "Good work," again, the same words in the same tone, as though nothing of any consequence had occurred in the preceding 2 weeks at all. Tibo did not touch the glass. He left the firm 4 months later. He told Fontaine it was for personal reasons, which was true in the sense that every reason he had left was personal now, personal in a way that made sitting across from desperate people and measuring their lives against debt schedules feel like something he was no longer capable of pretending was neutral. He never went back to Belle Reve. He never wrote to Janei DeLaqua. He never spoke publicly about what had happened in the study with the account books, or in the tribunal, or on the steps of the Baton Rouge courthouse in the afternoon heat. But 3 years later, in 1848,
a document surfaced in the New Orleans Picayune.
A letter written by an anonymous source that described in precise and devastating detail the full scope of Pierre DeLaqua's forgery operation. The land surveys, the timber contracts, the bills of sale, every fraudulent instrument that Solomon's skills had been conscripted to produce across 20 years of Pierre's management of the estate. The letter named no living person.
It named only Pierre, who was dead, and it named the contracts themselves, and it named the men who had benefited from them, men with offices in Baton Rouge and New Orleans and Shreveport, men who spent the following year in a state of legal and social anxiety that several of them did not survive intact. No one was ever able to identify the anonymous source.
The document examiner, Clarence Hudd, told a colleague over dinner that the handwriting style in the letter reminded him of something he had seen once before, a very specific formal flourish in the construction of certain letters, a style he associated with the notarial tradition of Saint-Domingue. His colleague asked him what he meant by that. Hudd said it was probably nothing and changed the subject. At Belle Reve, life continued. The sugar harvest of 1848 was the strongest the estate had produced in a decade. The 9 men remained. They remained the following year and the year after that. The plantation's accounts stayed current. No further debt was accumulated. No further representatives from any factor house were invited to the property.
Janei DeLaqua lived at Belle Reve until 1867, when the changed world that the war had made finally, legally, irrevocably altered the terms under which every human life in Louisiana was held. She died 2 years after that, in the spring of 1869, in the same house where she had pressed a hot iron to a man's wrist and called it ownership, in the same house where she had handed a fraudulent document to a junior accountant and called it truth, in the same house where 9 men had stood in a room and watched their freedom burn and decided, without permission from anyone, to survive it. Solomon outlived her by 11 years. He died in 1880, a free man in the only legal sense that had ever mattered, in possession of a small parcel of land adjacent to what had once been the Belle Reve estate, land that Janei had transferred to his name in a deed executed the year before she died. The deed was witnessed by 2 men and notarized by a 3rd, and its handwriting was precise and formal, and carried in every letter the particular flourish of a tradition that had crossed the ocean from Saint-Domingue 60 years before, and had refused, through everything, to be erased. Antoan Tibo never returned to the factor business. He spent the rest of his working life as a clerk for a small shipping company in Memphis, a quiet man who kept his opinions to himself and paid his bills, and was described by his neighbors in later years as someone who seemed to carry something heavy that he had never quite put down. He kept one thing from his time at Belle Reve, a small carved wooden figurine, which he had taken from the mantelpiece on his last morning in the house, slipping it into his coat pocket without entirely knowing why. He kept it on his desk for the rest of his life. He never explained it to anyone who asked. He simply said it was something he needed to remember, and when they pressed him on what exactly, he would look at it for a moment, with an expression no one who knew him could name, and then he would say, quietly, that some debts are not the kind you can collect, and some freedoms are not the kind you can destroy, and that the difference between the two was the only thing worth knowing. That was the truth Belle Reve had taught him. And unlike the document, unlike the payment schedule, unlike the censure and the bourbon and the career he had walked away from, that truth was one that no tribunal in Louisiana had the power to rule fraudulent. It had been written too deep and in too permanent an ink, by hands that had survived everything the law could do to them, and it would outlast every name on every deed and contract and bill of sale that Pierre DeLaqua had ever touched. Some things, once written in that kind of ink, Do not burn.